My name is Manuel Pastor, and I will be both speaking and moderating because our moderator, Frank Farrow, wound up getting stuck in D.C. He was ill. He tried to make it, actually got all the way to Dulles, and was advised to head back home. He'll be fine, but we wanted to make sure that he was in good health. So what we're each going to do is speak for 5 to 7 minutes. I will do very briefly an introduction of the panel. The first person speaking will be me, because I'm the moderator and I decided that. And my name is Manuel Pastor. I'm an accomplished scholar, and perhaps more important, I've been married to the same woman for 33 years, which shows, as we like to say, we've been married 33 years, many of them happily, which shows great persistence. So we will follow in the order of folks, how they're seated, with people who've been equally persistent about this idea of trying to make sure that markets can be made to work for low-income individuals. And we'll start with Kim Zeuli after me, who is Senior Vice President and Director of Research for the Initiative for Competitive Intercity, striving to help folks understand and identify the hidden assets of inner-city communities and connect them to markets, and she'll talk about the creative ways they're trying to do that. She'll be followed by Gary Painter, who's become a very good friend here. He's with the Price School of Public Policy. We've been working together on issues that have to do with immigrant integration, looking at the way immigrants deal with housing. He's going to be talking a little bit about the real estate aspects of this. And then finally, Jim Riccio from MDRC will be talking about one particular initiative in Chicago and sort of giving us a much better idea of how things work on the ground when we talk about connecting low-income individuals and low-income communities to market forces. Let me start by saying that for me, the idea of thinking about market forces in low-income communities actually came up in the wake of the Los Angeles civil uprising. In the wake of the LA civil uprising, many of us were running from meeting to meeting, thinking if we went to one more meeting, we'd actually solve something. Have you ever done that? Mm-hmm. You might be doing that now. So, and in the middle of one of those meetings, one activist said there's an immediate need to think long-term. And in thinking long-term, we realized a few things. One was that we needed to connect better to the regional economy and the regional debate. But we realized that when most people thought about how to grow an economy, they didn't take a sort of isolated neighborhood by neighborhood approach. And when you looked at the neighborhoods that were successful, often the people in those neighborhoods were working at other places that weren't in their neighborhood. That when we thought about doing place-based or community development, it was about bringing jobs to the neighborhood instead of about connecting the residents to employment and making the places where people live higher quality places for them to want to stay. And that, I think, is really the fundamental point that I would like to lift. And I think it's a point that Peter, in some sense, was really making as well in his discussion. That for those of us doing place-based development, it's very important to have a regional focus on where are the growing industries, where are the jobs that might be there in the future, where's the workforce development and the transit systems to connect people to those jobs. That is to think about bringing the resources in via connecting to the market for people who live in these neighborhoods. And that means a lot more attention to workforce development that I think has been traditionally a part of place-based strategies, which tend to focus on just generating employment within the neighborhood. Now, the second component to that, and this is sort of my second big point, is that we then need to think a little bit differently about the work that we do in communities. And there's an article that a colleague and I, Rachel Modello-Frosch from UC Berkeley, just wrote for Health Affairs. And by the way, I would encourage any of you, obviously, to read it. It's a very good article. But also, if you publish, to publish in a thing like Health Affairs, because these public health journals have impact factors that are like through the wazoo, and your academic career will thrive. So what we did there was try to take a look at the increasing sort of marriage of public health concerns and community development concerns. That is, if you think about the way both of these arose in the past, public health concerns being rooted in urban areas and epidemics and really taking a sort of systemic approach to health, but then since went very much kind of in the field of individualized health insurance and medical care, and has recently come back to the kind of systematic approach of looking at the social determinants of health that Dr. Ross talked about this morning. As they've done that, they've discovered something very interesting. You can only move those social determinants if you change power relations. So what you find with what Dr. Ross was talking about with the TCE building healthy communities is that the things that they're proudest of are the things where the community residents rose up and fought for a living wage campaign for hotel workers in Long Beach, where youth rose up and fought for a different set of truancy policies, where actually community organizing and power building has created the conditions to change the systematic determinants of health. Similarly, for those of us doing more community development or more sort of community-focused work, what we realized was that the CDC field went increasingly in the direction of bricks and mortar, that if we would simply build housing, somehow that would actually improve the neighborhood. And when you begin to then, instead of thinking about just the neighborhood, think about the regional economy and how to affect it, you begin to think about the need to build power. And what was interesting today when Peter mentioned the case of Richmond, which, by the way, opens up all sorts of interesting questions about doing this kind of work in a suburban type setting, is that in the case of Richmond, which is in Northern California, there's certainly an indigenous element that rose up within Richmond, but it was actually also the target of organizing by something called the Social Equity Caucus, sponsored by Urban Habitat, a region-wide power-building effort to try to change the debate about what would be happening in terms of social justice both in city and suburb. And so the sort of second big point is that as we move to this sort of new frame, we need to take place building seriously, but we need to take power building even more seriously, because people only get attention to their places if they can shift the balance of power. They can only move these outside forces if they also shift the balance of power. The final point I want to make before the sign comes up in a very threatening way is that all of this means that we who are really, what is our next conference going to be about? And here's what I think our next conference really ought to be about, is generating a different economic theory about how to create a more inclusive economy. What is striking to me is that we raise these big problems of widening income inequality, of too few jobs that are being produced, of huge gaps in the middle, of communities being left behind, of dangerous cleavages with increases in poverty in the suburbs, and then we have strategies like raise the minimum wage. That is, they are barely scraping at the surface of what needs to be an alternative economic theory about why inclusion will generate economic growth, and then what are the industries that we want to target to make that happen? What are the selective interventions that government can do that are not market threatening but market friendly and can move things forward in a way that will actually generate both regional and community development in a way that will really make a difference? And in order to do that, we need a lot more theory building about what would be a more inclusive economy. It's something that some of us are contributing to, but it's really at its infancy. The research is increasingly showing that inclusion at a metropolitan level will actually lead to more sustainable growth over time, but that doesn't amount to an economic strategy about how to do inclusion in a way that will be actually also conducive to growth and be friendly to the market as well.
So the first thing I'm going to say about ICIC, we're a nonprofit strategy and advising group, and we are located on Dudley Street. You heard about Dudley Street this morning. You're going to hear about it this afternoon. Well, we are actually located there. So just want to give a little shout out to Dudley Street in Roxbury, Boston, which is the inner city of Boston. We've got maps to prove that. So our mission, and this is the persistence that Manuel was talking about earlier, our mission, since we were established in 1994, is to drive economic growth in the inner city through private sector investment. So Michael Porter, who founded us, is a professor at Harvard Business School. He's an economist. I'm an economist. We have lots of economists, and we're based around economic theory and ICIC. So we've always been about market forces, limited government intervention, really trying to identify where it makes sense for them to intervene and where it's definitely necessary to do that. And really, thanks to Elwood and everyone who invited me to participate in the discussions this year around place-based, really, really informative. And I think ICIC, if I'm going to put us in this space that they were talking about earlier, we're place conscious. So we really are focused on the inner city, not neighborhoods. So I wrote a response to the book that they're compiling where I make an argument, and it's really ICIC's argument about why the inner city still matters. So we know there's growing poverty in the suburbs. Sometimes we go after Brookings a bit in a good-natured way. I think it's a very healthy debate, but there's still concentrated poverty in most cities, concentrated, persistent poverty. And we define inner city as contiguous census tracts of high poverty, high unemployment. And again, this is, there are a couple of exceptional cities out there like San Francisco and Seattle where maybe we're not seeing, as much of this as before, and it really has moved out. But in most cities, you still have an inner city. These places of high poverty and high unemployment. And when we look at cities with over 75,000 in population, there are 328 inner cities out there. So plenty for us to work on and to think about is why that's an interesting place to focus on. So Professor Porter's his seminal research around this in 1994, about that time period, and this is why ICIC was created, to really do something based on his research, which in and of itself is an interesting idea. Most academics don't create nonprofits to make sure their research has impact. So that was great. So his research around that time was analyzing the competitive advantages of inner city. And we heard that from Dr. Ross this morning. It really, instead of focusing on inner cities as areas of despair and problems, they took an asset-based perspective and said, are there competitive advantages to these areas? What are they? And they identified four: the strategic location of inner cities. Many of them are near downtown clients, surrounding key downtown areas. So in just-in-time delivery, which was really sort of all the rage, a lot of people talking about it in the early 90s, right? They're very close to many of their suppliers, or they're a close supplier to many of their clients. They're located near major transportation hubs. As somebody said earlier, ports don't move, right? Ports don't move. A lot of the inner cities are located around ports and other major infrastructures. There's an underutilized workforce. Again, this matters more when there's a tight market. Right now, that doesn't seem to be such an opportunity. We think more of that as a problem in today's high unemployment. But there are talented, deep pockets of great labor in these areas. And when we survey inner city businesses, they often talk about that as a strategic advantage, which is very interesting, not part of the mainstream conversation, and ICIC is one of the organizations that we need to do a better job talking about that. Unmet local demand. There's great opportunities for retail in these areas, and ICIC had this important research that came out about a decade ago talking about why retailers should think about locating there. Now we hear more about that in terms of the food desert conversations as well. And this idea of they have an advantage because they are connected to regional clusters. Now the whole concept of clusters can be a little bit confusing, and I have 2 minutes, so I'm not going to explain it all here so that you understand, but the clusters represent your competitive advantage in an area, and the inner city, if you can connect them to these regional, strong, and emerging growth clusters, you will be able to link the inner city to the regional economic growth trends. And that's what we call finding inclusive clusters and identifying those clusters. We just wrapped up a report with JP Morgan Chase where we looked at the 10 largest cities and tried to identify some of those inclusive cluster opportunities, and we're going to broaden and expand that research, do more in that, and understand how best to connect the the clusters that matter to inner cities and that are connected to regional growth trends. Because this means when you support small businesses, if you support them in the inner city and they're part of these strong and emerging clusters, then you're swimming with the tide rather than against it. So it becomes a lot easier to scale those businesses and create long-term employment opportunities. So let me just wrap with, since 1994, we've been working with and doing research on over 50 cities, and we've identified 3 key drivers of inner city growth. One is to improve that local business environment. That's done through the infrastructure investment. You've already heard people talk about that earlier today. I'm sure you'll hear it throughout the day. So really investing in the infrastructure. Go to an inner city area. In most cities, you'll see that it's really deplorable and it's a huge asset. And to leverage the anchors there, the hospitals, the universities, the large corporates that aren't moving, the community foundations, leverage those anchors to better support the local economy and to support local business growth. Implementing, that's the first one. The second one is implementing this cluster-based growth strategy in a way that connects the inner city to regional growth clusters. And the third one is supporting the growth of inner city businesses through management education, access to capital, and networking, contracting opportunities. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
In a room like this, I certainly risk saying things that you already know, so I'm not going to worry about that risk. My hope is maybe I'll say things that you already know in a slightly different way that triggers all the other things that you already know to spark the conversation, for today, to make the kinds of links that we're trying to make today in this session and throughout the conference. One of the things that, the kind of questions that come to my mind in thinking about this, is some of them already been brought up, but it's, certainly how to think about place-based solutions in the context of local and regional economies. I was not asked to speak about that, so fortunately Manuel covered that, and we're going to talk about that more in Q&A. Another question that has come up earlier is about how do you think about people moving in and out of places, and how does that kind of impact what our goals are in focusing on neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. Again, I'm not going to talk about that at this moment. I was actually asked to talk about how the functioning of the real estate market affects and can affect place-based solutions, can affect how we think about goals and metrics for success, and those kinds of things. And, real estate markets are incredibly good at pricing amenities. So amenities are those goods and bad things that are implicit in place, right? So what am I talking about? I'm talking about schools. I'm talking about access to jobs, access to transportation. I'm talking about exposure to toxins. I'm talking about public safety issues. Real estate markets do this. And they do this actually as information about these things come out, do it fairly rapidly, in fact. And so what does that mean? Well, one of the things that people often look at in terms of neighborhoods and our concern about things like affordable housing and so forth is we look at rent growth and rent changes and those kinds of things. And so the question I ask you just to think about just real quickly is, would you rather live in a neighborhood where rents are going up or down? Okay, so most of you answered up. And there's a reason why you answered up. Because if you are in a neighborhood where rents are going down, it likely means that either schools are getting worse, access to jobs is getting worse, access to transportation is getting worse, exposure to toxins is increasing, public safety is deteriorating. Those are the kinds of things, right? So we don't want to live in those places. Although for you individually, you might like your rent to go down as everybody else's rent is going up. The power of the forces in real estate markets don't allow that to happen very well. And there are consequences to imposing large-scale policy solutions to force that to happen, right? We want to live in places. We want these communities to reflect the kinds of positive changes in all of those things. We want schools to get better. We want these places to be places where people have access to jobs and so forth. So in that context, when we're thinking about kind of affordable housing and kind of how we imagine communities to evolve, we know that policies, sometimes affordable housing policies actually work to concentrate poverty, and we've seen those over the past 50 years, and we've seen the reactions to those. We've seen policy in the housing space to look to kind of how do we create mixed income communities. And you can do that by inclusionary zoning, and there's pros and cons to different kinds of ordinances around inclusionary zoning, and I can talk more about that later. You can do that with other kinds of structure and policy. One of the things that actually happens, just organically as neighborhoods are improving sometimes is you have people with more resources that might have access to better jobs that start moving into the neighborhood, right? And we start to worry about rents coming up. We worry about displacement. We use terms like gentrification, right, which have a particular connotation to them as something we're trying to fight against, right? But then we really have to, again, I like to think about the question in terms of at least those four elements. Like, are rents going up because schools are getting better? Are rents going up? And then you go down the list, right? Public safety, toxic environments, jobs. If they are, this is actually not something we would try to fight against. In fact, we actually, if we believe that mixed income neighborhoods are a good thing, the fact that some people with higher incomes are moving into neighborhoods that were more concentrated might itself not be a bad thing, depending on whether you believe that the kind of spillover effects from having those neighbors with kind of access and connections and role modeling effects, matter. So we have to think about it in a more kind of nuanced way. Of course, we're going to be concerned about displacement and rents going up if for some reason they're going up when the residents are not achieving access to better jobs, if they're not being reduced, their access to toxins, if public safety is not improving, and those kinds of things. So that's the way I hope that maybe organizing our thoughts around real estate markets can help us. So when we have these opportunities, as we have, for example, in Los Angeles, with new opportunities to transit stations, hubs, and so forth, those actually are opportunities to think very creatively about how one can create mixed income neighborhoods, how one can create access to jobs for large, for all segments of the population. So we have this opportunity in Los Angeles, and in many other cities where public transit infrastructure is expanding, to really think about how to leverage those new places, new spaces, so that community residents then accrue the benefits that sometimes show up in rents, right? And not face just a rent burden with somehow not getting those benefits.
I'm going to share some lessons from MDRC's research, led mostly by my colleague David Greenberg, on Chicago's New Communities program, which, as some of you may know, was a major comprehensive community initiative funded by the MacArthur Foundation and implemented by List Chicago in 14 Chicago neighborhoods. It was a 10-year initiative launched in 2003 and continues to be a core strategy for Lisk's ongoing work in communities. And I think the NCP experience is relevant to this session on markets because NCP is very much about building communities' local collective capacity to seize opportunities presented by market changes or to build effective defenses against possible pernicious effects of certain market conditions. An underlying principle of NCP is that community capacity is really embedded in organizational relationships at the local level, as well as in relationships that can influence government and private institutions outside of the local community. So the partnerships themselves are viewed as a kind of platform for achieving comprehensive community change across multiple domains. Once established, the partnerships can benefit the community even as conditions change, being redeployed or reconfigured to deal with new opportunities or new crises or shocks confronting the community. So thus it's believed that the stronger the collective or relationship capacity, so to speak, within the neighborhood, where organizations are working together rather than individually, the more effective communities will be in dealing with positive or negative market conditions and in improving neighborhood outcomes. In the evaluation, we're primarily interested in learning how well this NCP approach worked as a method to build and sustain this relationship capacity, and what conditions or factors made it easier or harder to achieve that goal. Now, the structure of NCP is in many ways distinctive, and it reflects the initiative's underlying theory. The structure includes a single managing intermediary working across the 14 neighborhoods. And this is what Lusk's role was, the managing intermediary. But at the local level, within each of the communities, was designated a local intermediary, so a CDC or a CBO, whose responsibility would be to become a convener, and delegator, creator of partnerships, not an agency that would do all the community projects itself, but an agency that would foster these partnerships. And together, each of the local agencies and its local partners produced a vision for community improvement called a quality of life plan for the neighborhood. And Lusk's role as a managing intermediary in this network was critical in that it provided day-to-day management of the initiative, technical assistance to each of the local communities, and played an accountability role as well to ensure that they were performing adequately. All the money that the communities were supposed to use to operate projects, they were supposed to raise on their own, although the MacArthur Foundation did provide seed grants. And all of the money and influence of the foundation flowed through Lusk as the managing intermediary, not to the localities directly. So what did NCP accomplish? Again, it's been over about 10 years, operate for about 10 years. There are clearly many successes. In some cases, NCP led to the formation of new productive collaborative relationships among community organizations that never worked together. In other cases, it deepened relationships among those who had partnered in the past. These local partnerships were able to attract some substantial resources that would have been more difficult to attract working alone. Lusk did help to broker with external public and private agencies and foundations, some support to the neighborhood, so it helped play a little bit of the advocacy role a number of speakers have already talked about in building those linkages with the policy system. And across these 14 communities, the local partnerships produced or expanded about 850 projects. So things were happening. Moreover, and this wasn't taken for granted at the beginning, but it was possible to see that CDCs could play this local intermediary role, not do all the work themselves, not just focus on a housing and a bricks and mortar agenda, but to advance a more comprehensive agenda. And again, Lusk played an important accountability role, in some cases having to switch the lead agencies in the localities, in some cases having to get staffing changes made in order for those local partnerships to work better. But there were, not surprisingly, important challenges. It was much easier, for example, to convene and promote collaboration during the planning phase of NCP than it was to achieve collaboration on implementation. Oftentimes, partners were at the table looking for a slice of the pie, but not necessarily joint action on the delivery end. And so this was a challenge that really had to be addressed, but was a difficult one to be addressed. Improvements among the local organizations mostly occurred within the neighborhoods rather than between neighborhoods and City Hall. So while relationships were forged, oftentimes they just did not get to the sources of power and influence that could change systems or some of these larger market forces that affected those neighborhoods. Now, Lusk was in a position as the managing intermediary to actually foster the neighborhood ties. And when it did this, the neighborhoods were quite appreciative. And in fact, there was a hope, really, that more of that could be done. But that's a potential valuable contribution that a managing intermediary could play. There are a number of conditions I don't really have time to discuss that contributed to whether the local partnerships were stronger or weaker. They had to do with things like the degree of pre-existing trust that existed, the degree to which there were even a collection of strong organizations in a community to build with. In fact, in several communities, there was no organization that could play a lead partnership role, and Lusk had to develop them from scratch. So context clearly matters. There are a number of management practices that also matter. And finally, I just wanted to comment on the question of, really probably the ultimate question, is whether collective capacity, if it is built, does it actually improve community outcomes? Does it actually move the needle on any indicators, on employment, or crime, or student achievement, or housing? And not surprisingly, given the size of the communities Lusk was operating in, and looking at some trend data, the answer is probably no. But this question itself became a really important source of tension between Lusk and MacArthur, because MacArthur was understandably looking to see some real change on measurable outcomes. They wanted to see needles move. They wanted to see a return on their investment. And some of it, of course, was completely unrealistic, again, given the size of the communities and the resources which MacArthur understand. But it did kind of move the discussion toward maybe we need to narrow the focus of the goals that the communities are focusing on, and thinking of comprehensiveness, less in terms of comprehensiveness in terms of the array of things where a community is going to try to change at the same time, but comprehensiveness in the sense of corralling resources and organizations to focus on bigger changes in a narrower domain, at least at a particular point in time. And so again, thinking about the market is, the question of whether a community tries to tackle all of the different market conditions that are affecting their neighborhood. It takes a more strategic approach and a narrower approach to try, and maybe even a more geographically targeted approach to try to make a measurable difference.
I wanted to, and you'll have a chance to participate more quickly than you think. What is an inclusive cluster? And then how do you actually get public policy to support those kind of clusters rather than other kind of clusters? How do you define an inclusive cluster?
So, let's see if that works. So inclusive clusters are those clusters that employ a greater share of inner city workforce and create more jobs in the inner city than other clusters. So that's what we look at when we try to identify an inclusive cluster approach. So it's the strong clusters, they're performing strong or they're emerging, but they also have a relatively higher performance in the inner city than in the broader region.
So in Los Angeles, for example, there would be food processing probably,
Potentially.
and also I think there's a lot of medical equipment work.
Yeah.
But then how do you get government, which is more fascinated on the sort of shiny, big Toyota plant, which might be a great thing for a region to get. How do you get them to focus in on these clusters that actually serve the communities that we care about?
So that's one of the things we try to work on. So when cities, and interestingly, as part of that JP Morgan Chase study, we looked at the economic development plans for all of the 10 large cities, and they all have clusters as part of their economic development plans. But I don't think, and we didn't really dive into this, but I would say most of them picked those clusters based on their regional performance. Are they strong and emerging for the region, the MSA? And they didn't look at whether they were relatively high performing in the inner city. So they didn't look at the potential impact of them for the inner city. So that's what they need to look at. And if they can then identify those, that can be part of their broader economic development plan. The only city we know of that's doing that right now is New Orleans, and they just put out an economic development strategy, the New Orleans Business Alliance, where we worked with them as part of that strategy, and they picked clusters specifically because of the high growth for the inner city.
And one way that might be rooted in sort of the specificities of New Orleans politics, particularly post-Katrina,
Right.
and the way in which people feel like they've been displaced from the recovery. If you were to think about how to move business organizations and government at a regional level to actually do this kind of cluster approach rather than what's the more traditional, pick the ones that have the fastest growth and the highest wages rather than
Yeah.
these career entry points?
Yeah. I think it's getting to your point about making the argument about how inclusion creates broader economic growth. And what New Orleans learned is when half of your population is in the inner city and you're hit by a shock, in their case it was a natural disaster, your entire city suffers, right, because of that lack of connection. So I think it's making that argument to the city, helping them better understand that. We are in the middle of doing some new research that I think will be supportive of it. There's one thing we also understand is that these regional clusters that are high growth, there's some support that's happening within the inner city. So
Yeah.
we need to identify that as well to make that argument.
Great. So let me ask Gary a couple questions. Gary, you're easy to ask questions not only because I know you, but because Gary started his presentation by saying, these are 2 or 3 things I wanted to talk about that they didn't let me, right? So I wanted to lift one up that I think about a lot too. It's about neighborhoods that are platforms rather than neighborhoods that are simply places where people stay. So when we traditionally think about how sort of a neighborhood, with what's a measure of neighborhood improvement, we might say, well, home ownership went up. But if it's an immigrant platform, you may not want home ownership to go up because it's a place where people can arrive, rent, and sort of turn over time. And it's an intriguing thing you kind of raised early on is how do you think about places that have a lot of migration in and out? What does success mean there?
So I wish I had the answer to that question. It is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And I do get back to this, what you framed early, which is an access to both local economies and regional economies so that you can then move to other places that might be better situated to take advantage of those things. We don't want to remove, as you said, platform places. We want those kinds, but the question is what exists in a platform place? What are the characteristics that are there? And so the notions of having, these are places where people, community residents are engaged in the political process, have political power, where residents in those places do have access to transit, jobs, where schools are high quality, so that when their rents are going up, it's because it's reflecting that they're actually getting access to the things that actually will change their lives for the better. So it to me, I haven't figured out kind of a set of metrics where we can just point to those and say, this is a terrific platform place because of these particular characteristics, yet, like you said, ownership may not be the right one in this kind of a community. And so that's where some of my thinking is going, but it's certainly not come to any conclusions at this point.
I think we're both economists. It said about the economists that if you took all the economists in the world and laid them end to end, they still couldn't reach a conclusion. So we share that. I did want to ask you about one other thing that I thought was intriguing. I'm going to push you on it, but only because I think there's a place where there's no answer here either. You were, I think, pretty eloquent about the way in which if neighborhood rents are going up, but the amenities are actually improving and those accrue to the residents, that then in fact is probably a good thing, and it's not what we typically mean when we say gentrification, which is a kind of code word for displacement. But of course, more qualitative research shows that people in these communities, like the Lance Freeman book, There Goes the Hood, they appreciate the amenities if they're able to stay. We're under a lot of pressure here in Los Angeles right now with regard to so-called gentrification and displacement. For those of you not from LA, downtown LA had 5,000 people living in it 15 years ago, almost all of them homeless. Now it's got about 75,000. The hottest neighborhoods in Los Angeles are some around the transit, but also sort of Silver Lake and Echo Park, which were heavily immigrant neighborhoods. So there's a lot of these kind of issues. How do you actually make sure when that's going on that residents do get a chance to get some of those benefits? What are your thoughts?
Well, a couple of things. One is, if you're thinking about housing markets, and this sometimes is kind of contrary to the community that is, doing terrific work in affordable housing and providing that to residents. But it might make a lot of sense to have planning processes in place to actually house the 75,000 residents of downtown Los Angeles in downtown Los Angeles. And you're seeing some of that happening, for example, in a place like downtown LA. Why? Because that's going to reduce the pressure for them to spill over into the places you mentioned, MacArthur Park, etc. So actually bringing units online is a terrific first step. Is it the only step? No. But it is a terrific first step of kind of alleviating the supply and demand pressures that us economists are good at teaching in our Econ 101 classes, and certainly affect markets and so forth. There is also, I think, a role for community benefit agreements in thinking about how, when development's happening, when changes are happening, to make sure that local community residents actually get a bonus to applying for the jobs that start to exist. So we're sitting here at a university in a community that has high levels of poverty, not that far away from our proximate location. One of the things that has certainly happened, and USC can be, praised and, condemned in different ways in different times for some of the things that have happened, but they have engaged in some of these agreements, and some of these places that used to be like a Chevron gas station is now, a multi kind of use facility with ground floor retail and a bunch of housing. Well, having students housed there, and having jobs go to local residents in those retail locations is a positive step forward. Is it enough? No. But it does help alleviate those kinds of things. So some of those community benefit agreements, if they're not in place to simply restrain development, which sometimes they are, has become kind of, let's do this to keep developers out from making too much money, but instead can be a collaborative process. I think there's actually some good that can be shared by all, and to use the word inclusion, which you eloquently brought up, I think that is an inclusive strategy.
Jim, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll go very quickly to the audience. Because I was intrigued by the way that Lusk was the intermediary for 14 communities. And anybody who's in the philanthropic world knows that when you choose an intermediary, there can be good intermediaries and there can be bad intermediaries, right? There can be ones that piss everybody off in the neighborhood, right? And ones that are viewed as honest brokers. You're saying nice things about Lusk. You should probably continue to do that since they might give you money for a project. But just more generally, that was a joke, come on. More generally, what do you think makes for a good intermediary? What did you learn from that process that sounded like the communities actually appreciated what Lusk was doing? What was it doing that was good? And where have you seen kind of intermediary stuff that's stuff to avoid?
It was clearly doing good stuff, good technical assistance, guidance, offering good structure at the planning stages as communities were developing their own plans, but they were doing it in a very serious way with Lusk making sure the process was rigorous and actually got to making decisions. Lusk was also, I think, effective in some cases mediating conflicts at the community level because they're an outside kind of honest broker. I mean, they did have legitimacy within the community. They mediated some conflicts. They helped build some of the networks, as I mentioned, and some communities, really highly disinvested, historically disinvested communities, didn't really have much of a pool of partners to begin with, and no one that really had the capacity to play that role. So they had to build those organizations from scratch. And as I mentioned, where things there were two ways in which their role, I think, was challenged and where improvements could have been made, although it's a tough challenge. It's after the planning phase and helping organizations deliver collaboratively, not just get their separate little projects, but actually deliver collaboratively. That's a tougher thing to pull off. And helping the local partnerships keep the local intermediaries keep their partners at the table during the delivery phase. Now, part of List's challenge was simply capacity. They're not a huge organization. Lot of communities, a lot of actors within each of those communities, and a lot of projects. So they didn't have the capacity to provide the same kind of accountability and corrective action assistance when it came to particular projects. Because there were so many. And they didn't necessarily have the range of expertise in these comprehensive initiatives that were covering so many domains. They didn't necessarily have the substantive expertise. So it's useful to be thinking of in phases of the planning phase, which calls for a certain set of expertise, and then the delivery phase, and that's where it gets a little tougher. The other way in which they were potentially more critical was as the liaison to the outside community. So during their Great Recession, they were able to help the local communities access some federal stimulus money, access foundation money, and in some ways accredited with helping some of the partnerships weather the severe city cutbacks in funding and keep some of those going as viable entities. They had the potential to bridge across neighborhoods, so they could unite as a coalition for policy change. And I think it was kind of stretching their capacity, but they were well positioned to do that. And maybe with more time and resources, they could have done it more effectively.
So one thing I've seen sometimes when an intermediary gets chosen to deliver support to multiple sites or multiple places is that they're kind of perceived as this outsider and a little bit arrogant or something. It sounds like Lusk approached that with some degree of humility and real relationship building. Yeah. Was that kind of just the people who were doing it, or are there sort of structural things you saw that helped build that trust?
Well, I think they recognized they weren't delivering. This whole initiative depended on local partnerships. They didn't have all the direct relationships with the local partners. So and the whole philosophy of the initiative was this was to be the communities were to come up with their own plans. So by design, they saw themselves in a support function. But they did have an accountability role as well, particularly when it came to the administering these seed money grants that MacArthur was providing. So I think, I think the nature of the initiative defined Lusk's role in a primarily supportive role, in which case I think they had to be humble and recognize that community relationships are often fraught. There's a lot of history behind them, a lot of conflict, and they can't control it all.
So there's some lessons there about program design as well as maybe choosing the right intermediary. Very quickly, we're going to go to the audience, but 1 minute each. What question should I have asked you? I asked you what I was interested in. What would you have liked to have said?
The idea of seizing markets, defending against markets, what strikes me is that neighborhoods, it just doesn't happen. It's not going to happen on its own. Neighborhoods need guidance, they need structure, they need these liaisons, and it's just worth thinking hard about how you approach that kind of mobilization task and what's a good structure for promoting that.
So that intermediary role is really critical.
I don't know if it's a question you should have asked me, but you could have brought me to task for kind of the obvious, which is, well, affordable housing is not just about rents, but it's about a ratio of rents to income. So why didn't you emphasize that? So that could have been a question that you asked me as being way too simple-minded with how I was describing. Obviously, I was trying to highlight something that gets often ignored as I have student after student that cares about these issues come into my office and say, this is horrible, the rents for businesses are going up. I said, tell me exactly why it's horrible that rents for local businesses are going up, because there might be a reason behind that, right? So I am not unaware of the fact that when we think about affordable housing, that is a ratio of rents to income, but we need to make sure that we think about the processes that generate rental changes and income changes so that we can better understand how that ratio comes together.
I think just asking more about the drivers of economic growth that I threw out there and didn't elaborate on in any way.
So what we're going to do is open it up and for you to say something that struck you, a question you have, something you think is missing and needs to be part of this conversation, and we'll ask you to come up and use the mic.
But one of the things that we both brought up was about Manuel's point about a new economy, saying, our next conference should maybe be talking about how do we develop a new economy, and also filtering in or connecting the point about inclusion, and how do we drive inclusion, diversity, equity, racial equity around creating new economies. And kind of my own little piece was, how do we do that without the fear factor that you lead with that new businesses fail 95% of the time. How do we move that forward?
I think that one of the things that we need to do is move beyond the argument that we've been making about how a lack of disparity can actually promote economic growth, to then really specifying what that means. What are the right kind of job training programs that connect people? What do we need to do about the community college system, which is where the majority of youth of color and immigrant youth are actually becoming educated? How do we articulate them with the strategies? And actually, most importantly, how do we start ranking? Well, even people who say that they support the free market, you look at Texas and the amount of subsidies it gives to businesses to locate there are essentially driving particular kind of industries forward. And really the qualitative question that Kim is kind of raising is, if we're going to be making some of those choices, what kind of jobs are we trying to attract? Who do we think is going to get those kind of jobs, et cetera? Jacksonville, Florida, for example, when it gives subsidies, tries to make sure that the businesses that are coming in pay at 135% of the median wage. So with every new business they're bringing in, they're driving the median wage up rather than driving the median wage down, at least with their own money. I think there's other kind of criteria that can be there, and I think that this is the beginning of a discussion.
One thing we're seeing in cities right now is, cities have sort of understood that small business growth is part of economic growth, and there's a lot of emphasis on growing small businesses, which is great. But it's just been a scattershot approach in most cities, and let all poppies bloom and support all entrepreneurs. And the support has no focus on specific industries, and there's not much focus, if any, in most cities on scaling businesses. It's all about the very micro businesses, which do have high failure rates. So what we know is in every inner city, there's lots of high growth firms. So it's trying to figure out where the competitive advantages are for that particular city. Not everyone's going to be a tech center, right? What is it for your city? Where are businesses already growing? How do you make sure that they scale? That's part of the inclusion. And those are the inner city businesses that are employing a lot of inner city residents.
There's this huge opportunity opening up right now with executive action. Because for those communities that are actually rich and undocumented immigrants, probably about half of the labor force is going to be able to all of a sudden switch jobs and actually begin to think about accessing training in a way that actually will move them over time. And part of the reason why there's such a big debate about this is really interesting about what the president did with executive action, assuming it sticks, is it's 3 years. What's interesting about that, it means it lands in after the first year of the next president's administration. So that next president is going to have to actively make a decision to put 5 million people back into the threat of deportation. The political challenges with that are going to be problematic. And what that means is that this change is going to be really significant, and it represents a real economic opportunity in terms of entrepreneurship, the ability of people to explore markets and switch between jobs, because currently people are very scared to switch between jobs because they will need to show documents that they lack, and over the last couple of years technology has been going up in such a way that it's more difficult for people to move jobs with documents that are not strong. So anyway, very interesting opportunities.
Hi, I'm Malo Hudson. I'm a professor in city planning at Berkeley. I have a question for Manuel and Gary and others. If you feel like asking or jumping in, please do. When I think about housing and certainly the movement of people back into cities, and I really appreciate your comments about how to really think about amenities. I see this happening in San Francisco and obviously other cities with strong markets. But it's a sustainability and health question, sort of the things you raised along with what Gary raised, is that as you see rents going up, and you talked about some of the policies, whether it be CBAs, but they're not really enforceable by law unless they're structured real, have real accountability. Are there other policies that you see that are possible or strategies to increase the mixed income within certain communities, and certainly within the sustainability framework? And I'm thinking more in California, so it's an inside California discussion, but around SB 375 that is driving the state to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions and encouraging development within the urban core, and what that's doing for people who are on the poor or so forth.
For those from out of state, could you say a word about what
It's a Senate Bill 375. I apologize for our acronyms, and it is a goal, I believe, passed in 2008 by the state to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and part of that is to create these sustainable community strategies across the state. There are 18 of them, I believe, and within that, each region has to have a strategy around housing, transportation, and so forth. So it's led to quite a bit of transit-oriented development, which then leads to higher cost around. Talk about an amenity, right? Especially in a place like California, where everyone is tired of being stuck in traffic. So it's great in the sense that it's having people want to live closer to transit, but at the same time, it's driving up cost and all these great amenities around there. People want to walk and have cafes and that sort of thing. But what does that mean for lower income people who now, coincidentally, are now going further out, right?
So I'll just say maybe a couple of things. It's one of those things that, and not just because I'm an economist that I don't have the answer. It's just that this is one of those really, pervasive problems that, all the people around the room are thinking about and trying to figure out, right? In terms of how do you connect communities to the kinds of opportunities vis-a-vis the free market, and also vis-a-vis, the political power structures that are going to influence the placement of those amenities. And so I guess for me, I think more research can be done in terms of understanding what amenity is driving the kind of prices that we're observing, and learning that and understanding that mechanism might really help those who are in the community to kind of gauge, are there danger signals here, or are these like positive signals of the trends that we want to encourage, in fact, in these places. In terms of how to make sure that we can have these mixed income communities that are thriving and those kinds of things, I would like to propose something that's completely politically infeasible, in terms of a theory. And so which has to do with how do you make, for example, subsidized housing programs available to more people rather than, simply, you give a really big benefit to very few people. I'd love us to actually move that direction. And the reason I would is because it actually builds in a cushion for when rents go up in places where there are opportunities. Those programs, are kind of automatic stabilizers, if you will, because then people would actually, not see their actual rents go up until their incomes go up, their contribution. Unfortunately, I'm not particularly optimistic about how our subsidized housing programs at federal and perhaps local levels can be restructured in that way. There's been people, calling for that for a while, and we haven't seen movement in that space. That is an area that, because I can sit back in the academy for a moment, I can throw out there as a thought-provoking thing, but I caution myself to even mention it because I haven't seen evidence of political feasibility.
So I think, and I'll go to Bart in a second, that to get at Mala's question at the, while I was suggesting that raising the minimum wage, which I definitely agree with, is not a way to restore the middle class, it is a way to deal with some of these gentrification pressures for those who are the lowest income. And that would be very important in a place like Los Angeles, which is now considered an increase in the minimum wage. The other thing, which I think is kind of interesting, and I think others might want to explore this in other states, is we've got three major sort of greenhouse gas emissions pieces of legislation. One is the Global Warming Act, which mandates reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The second is a 375 which actually mandates then sustainable community strategies to reduce vehicle miles traveled in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the third is 535. And 535 is taking the revenues from cap and trade and setting aside 1/4 of them for communities that face environmental and social disadvantage, with 10% of those revenues to be directly invested in those communities. This is a huge, to the extent that that could be replicated in other states, it would be very interesting. For California, this is a huge opportunity to generate new resources that are specifically targeted around both alleviating poverty and dealing somehow with greenhouse gas emissions. Affordable housing, so people can take advantage of transit, can be and will be probably a very important part of that.
In all the work that we did, the holy grail is mixed income. And if you take real estate forces that we've seen, lots of communities that did lots of things to clean up crime, to organize, you put affordable housing in. Markets are very powerful, and they tend to tilt all one way or another. When we saw the Starbucks, the game was up. It was tilting all the way. And so we went back to do a lot of research. Actually, your suggestion was enacted in Singapore. Now, that has a little bit different power structure, where one person says what's going to happen, and it did, and it was remarkable. But if you go back, if you take race out of the equation and you go to Paris or elsewhere, or even New York, where rent control, which is an evil word for economists, the only places you really see truly mixed income is where there's some kind of control on the affordable. And I think New York has tried with 50 years of affordability. If you're going to put a large subsidy in, it's got to be 50 years of affordability, so that if the neighborhood does change and clean up, there are beneficiaries of it who have been in that struggle. But this is a constant issue, and it's a huge issue in communities. And it's a huge issue around services and jobs and everything else. Do you want them to change? And if they do change, can you stop the change from driving people out of desirable places in the city? And I just love comments from all of you on that.
In these areas of concentrated poverty, one of the biggies, right? And the challenge in addressing public safety, and I've actually done some very complicated modeling work where we actually tried to model the LA metropolitan region a little bit, and we wanted to see how people's choices would change if you changed crime in places. And we saw communities in South LA that all of a sudden went from very low home ownership to high home ownership, because now this is a place that all sorts of people wanted to go. The people within the Black community didn't move out to own homes, they moved within, and so forth. So there was some really interesting things that happened there. The problem with kind of just saying, well, we need to have better public safety is that the policing strategies that might be brought to bear are not those that necessarily are going to improve community health, and some of that was already talked about today.
It actually has me thinking of something a little bit different, but the issue of the capacity to build mixed income from within, and Marge referred to this in her comments, by increasing the capacity of individuals in a place to enhance their income and make a choice of whether they stay in a particular community and leave. And in listening to the exchange, I was thinking about a study we did in public housing called the Jobs Plus Employment Initiative in Public Housing, which was a rigorously studied intervention, and had some strong impacts relative to people in comparison or controlled development, housing developments. But what was particularly interesting is we looked at the effects of the program both on individuals, so in an individual cohort, and looked at their progress over time, whether they continued to live in the development or not, and the effects on development level employment rates and average earnings, recognizing that there's churn, and from one year to the next, the people living in the development may differ. And we found this interesting pattern where in two of the cities, LA actually was one of the places where the program was effective for individuals. in LA and in St. Paul, Minnesota, had effects on individuals. And much of you also saw an effect on average income change in the place, because tight housing markets made it very difficult for those families to go anywhere else. They weren't reaching the point where they could afford the kind of housing that was in the community. So a lot of the money kind of stayed in the place, and you could argue that's a way of building mixed income from within. In Dayton, Ohio, we saw a very different pattern, which we attribute to the very soft housing market at the time. And there were some substantial effects on individuals, but year to year, no change in average earnings in the community, within the public housing population, which is because people were moving out. So with higher earnings, they were moving out. New people were coming in. So in a sense, it kind of functioned as that platform you were referring to, earlier, and it's just very important in thinking about these dynamics to take into consideration mobility patterns within a particular neighborhood and the larger housing market within which it's situated, a Dayton versus an LA.
You know, mixed income is one of those phrases that's thrown out there a lot. What do we really mean by it? What is the right mix? And what do residents want? There's a lot of literature about where people would choose to live and whether they would choose to live in a really mixed income neighborhood or not, where then the disparities in wealth make them feel less good about their own income. So there's some sort of that happiness factor and social well-being that's also important to understand.
Terry.
Just I guess I'd like to emphasize that, I think someone actually mentioned, I don't know who it was, so there's no blame to go around, but someone said, let's abstract from race in whatever the comment was. We just can't do that, right? Because, the kinds of forces that we're talking about, if there was exclusion from housing markets, if there's exclusion from labor markets that have been there and persistent, then you can't start with the premise, let's ignore race here, and then let's just kind of go forward, right? So I just think that's, was not the thrust of my comments, but I just think it needs to be part of how we're thinking about things, because the things that led to the concentrated neighborhoods might have actually been, as Marge Turner eloquently said, right? They might have been exactly race-based processes that caused that. So it's hard to completely abstract from race if we're trying to move to a place where all of these communities can have those access points that are needed for the residents to be successful.
A lot of commentary so far today is focused on changing capitalism and making some big economic changes, and I'd say it worries me a little bit in that, not that those wouldn't be good things to do, but we need to be careful not to lose the focus on particular communities and how we might intervene in particular places. And again, that raises issues of capacities and structures tied to particular places in the here and now. The changing capitalism is a much bigger lift.
Let me conclude with my own last comment, and actually it's prompted by this conversation and the point I kind of want to finish with. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book, This Could Be the Start of Something Big. I wish it had sold better than it did, but it's still my favorite book. And my favorite line in that book is, this is not the book we meant to write. Because we went out to write a book that was mostly about how communities might be using sort of policy tools to better connect to the regional economy, to pursue regional equity. And as we went and talked to the groups that were doing this, for example, the group that built Power in Richmond that Peter was talking about, when we talked to the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, we talked to the Gamaliel Organizing Federation, we realized that they were thinking about policy, but more fundamentally they were thinking about power, because they thought they could never really make the policy stick unless they built the power of these communities and unless they built a broader narrative into which people could buy, that they could then move, not to the middle, but move the middle of America to the kind of policies and programs and politics that they wanted. So as much as we wind up focusing in, as we rightly should, on clusters and strategies and policies, the fundamental issues that were lifted up this morning that came up for Bob too, through the investments in TC about power building as well as place building remain central. Thank you, and let's thank the panel.